Chapter 8. European Activity in India, 1498 to c. 1765. When the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama landed at Calicut, now Kozhikode, in 1498, he was restoring a link between Europe and the East that had existed many centuries previously. The first known connection between the two regions was Alexander the Great's invasion of the Punjab, 327 to 325 BCE. In the 2nd century BCE, Greek adventurers from Bactria founded kingdoms in the Punjab and the bordering Afghan hills. These survived into the late 1st century. This territorial contact in the north was succeeded by a lengthy commercial intercourse in the south, which continued until the decline of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE. Trade with the East then passed into Arab hands, and it was mainly concerned with the Middle Eastern, Islamic, and Greek worlds until the end of the European Middle Ages. The only physical contact with Europe came from occasional travelers, such as the Italians Marco Polo and Niccolo dei Conti, and the Russian Afanasy Nikitin in the 15th century, and these were few because of commotions within the tolerant Arab-Islamic world created by successive incursions of Turks and Mongols. For Europe in 1498, therefore, India was a land of spices and of marvels attested to by imaginative Greek authors. For Muslims, Europe was the land of Rum, Rome, or the Greek Empire of Constantinople, Turkish after 1453, and, for Hindus, it was the abode of the foreigners called Yavnas, a corruption of the Greek word. Ionian. The Portuguese. The Portuguese were the first agents of this renewed contact, because they were among the few Europeans at that time to possess both the navigational know-how and the necessary motivation for the long sea voyage. During the 15th century, the direct routes for the Indian trade via the Red Sea and Egypt or across Persia, Iraq, Syria, and Anatolia had become increasingly blocked, mainly by activities of the Ottoman Empire. The surviving Egyptian route was subject to increasing exploitation by a line of middlemen, ending with the Venetian near monopoly of the European trade in the eastern Mediterranean, and in 1517 it likewise passed under Ottoman suzerainty. The motive for finding a new route was therefore strong, especially among the Portuguese and the Spanish, who had inherited crusading zeal from wars against the Muslims, Moors, in Iberia and North Africa. Both countries sought an indirect route to the east, but Spain became focused on exploiting the wealth of the New World, discovered while seeking a new route to Asia, while the Portuguese, bolstered by navigational techniques learned from the Genoese, rivals of the Venetians, sought a route to the east around southern Africa. Vasco da Gama, upon his arrival in Calicut, hoped to find Christians cut off by Muslim expansion, to deal a blow at Muslim power from their maritime rear, as it were, and hoped to corner the European spice trade. He found his Christians in the Syrian communities of Cochin and Travancore, he found the spices, and he found Muslim Arab merchants entrenched at Calicut. It was his successors, Francisco de Almeida and Afonso de Albuquerque, who established the Portuguese Empire in the east. Almeida set up a number of fortified posts, but it was Albuquerque, governor 1509-15, who gave the empire its characteristic form. He took Goa in western India in 1510, Malacca in the East Indies in 1511, and Hormuz in the Persian Gulf in 1515, and he set up posts in the East Indian Spice Islands, Indonesia. The object of these moves was to establish for Portugal a strategic command of the Indian Ocean, so as to control the maritime spice trade, and thereby cripple the economy of the Ottoman-controlled Middle East. While Malacca was the nerve center for the spice-producing islands of Indonesia, and the exchange mart for the trade with the Far East, East Asia. Goa, not Malacca, was the capital because of Portuguese concern with the Ottoman threat. The Portuguese method was to rely on sea power based on fortified posts and backed by settlements. Portuguese ships, sturdy enough to survive Atlantic gales and mounted with cannon, could easily dispose of Arab and Malay shipping. The bases enabled the Portuguese to dominate the main sea lanes, but Portugal, with fewer than 1 million people and involved in Africa and South America as well, was desperately short of manpower. Albuquerque turned his fortresses into settlements to provide a resident population for defense. Intermarriage was encouraged. At the same time, Christianity was encouraged through the church. Goa became an archbishopric. St. Francis Xavier started from Goa on his mission to the South Indian fishermen. The Inquisition was established in 1560. The new mixed population thus became firmly Roman Catholic and provided a stubborn resistance to attacks. A lack of resources precluded any attempt to establish a land empire. Portugal's control of the Indian Ocean, its period of empire, lasted through the 16th century. During this time it attained great prosperity. Goa acquired the title of Golden, and it became one of the world's wonder cities. Trade with Europe was a royal monopoly, and, in addition, a system of licenses for all inter-Asian trade enriched the royal exchequer. Inter-Asian trade was free to individual Portuguese, and it was the profits of this, combined with trimmings from the royal monopoly, that gave them their affluence. The three marks of the Portuguese Empire continued to be trade, anti-Islamism, and religion. The Portuguese early considered that no faith need be kept with a non-Christian, and to this policy of perfidy they added a tendency of cruelty beyond the normal limits of what was a cruel age. The result was to deprive them of Indian sympathy. In religion the Portuguese were distinguished by missionary fervor and intolerance. Examples of the former are the Madura mission of Roberto di Nobili, 1577 to 1656, nicknamed the White Brahmin, and the Jesuit missions to the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. Of the latter, there was the Inquisition at Goa and the forcible subjection of the Syrian Church to Rome at the Synod of Diamper in 1599. The Portuguese thus had few friends in the East to help them in a crisis, and in 1580 the Portuguese kingdom was annexed to Spain. Thenceforth, until 1640, Portuguese interests were sacrificed to those of Spain. Because of the Spanish failure to quell a Dutch rising in the Netherlands, and after the English defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, the route to the east was open to both English and Dutch. This first real impact that Europeans had on India left distinct, though not extensive traces. The first is the mixed population of Goans and other Luso-Indians along the western coast of India and in Sri Lanka, and with them a lingua franca in the ports and markets. Then came Roman Catholicism, which today has millions of followers and an array of churches, convents, and colleges all over India. More tangible traces include imported commodities such as tobacco, potatoes, pineapples, tomatoes, papayas, cashew nuts, and chilies. The Dutch. In the race to the east after the Spanish obstacle had been removed, the Dutch, having ample resources, were the first to arrive after the Portuguese. Their first voyage was in 1595, helped by the local knowledge of Jan Hein van Linschoten, who had worked for 6 years in Goa. Jacob van Nek's voyage to the East Indies, Indonesia, in 1598 to 1600 was so profitable, 400% for all of his ships, that the die was cast for a great eastern adventure. The Dutch objective was neither religion nor empire but trade, and the trade in mind was the spice trade. The Dutch were monopolists rather than imperialists. Empire came later, in the 18th century, as a safeguard for monopoly. The Dutch therefore went directly to the East Indies, the main source of spices, and only secondarily to southern India for pepper and cardamom, and to Ceylon, Sri Lanka, for these and cinnamon. From 1619 their headquarters were fixed at Batavia, Jakarta, in Java, from which they developed a series of outlying stations in the East Indian islands, e.g., Celebes, Sulawesi, and the Moluccas, and intermediate ones such as Cape Town in South Africa, along with Ceylon for supply. This was the work of the Governor-General Jan Pieter Zoon Cohen, served 1618 to 23, 1627 to 29, and the whole system may be said to have been completed under the Governor-General John Maetsuyker, served 1653 to 78. The Dutch system demanded the control of the eastern seas, and this meant the elimination of European rivals, beginning with the Portuguese. The Dutch succeeded with superior resources and better seamanship, but the Portuguese, though defeated, were not destroyed. Ousted from most strongholds, the Portuguese retained their capital, Goa, in spite of blockades and sieges. They did not cede the area to India until 1961. The second European obstacle was the English, who followed the Dutch to the East Indies, no match for the Dutch in resources. The English were virtually excluded from the East Indies when, in 1623, the Dutch seized their factory, trading post, at Amboina, present-day Ambon, and executed its agents and allies, an action the English later dubbed the Amboina Massacre. It remained for the Dutch to organize their trade, which was operated through the Dutch East India Company, a complicated organization dominated by the maritime state of Zeeland. Much larger than the English company, it had the character of a national concern. Dutch sea power, more efficient than that of the Portuguese, secured monopoly conditions in the islands and sealands. It was only in land areas, such as Travancore, that resort had to be made to competition. But there remained the problem of trade, for the Dutch, like the English, were short of exchange goods. Textiles were needed to buy spices in Indonesia, and silver was needed to buy textiles, cotton or silk, in India and China. To work the spice monopoly, the Dutch developed an elaborate system of eastern trade from the Persian Gulf to Japan, the ultimate object of which was to secure the goods with which to secure the spices without recourse to scarce European resources. It was this trade that brought the Dutch to India at Surat, on the Coromandel coast, Negaptum, in Bengal, and upcountry at Agra. The British, 1600 to 1740. The English venture to India was entrusted to the English East India Company, which received its monopoly rights of trade in 1600. The company included a group of London merchants attracted by Eastern prospects, not comparable to the national character of the Dutch company. Its initial capital was less than 1/10 of the Dutch company's. Its object, like that of the Dutch, was to trade in spices, and it was at first modestly organized on a single voyage basis. These separate voyages, financed by groups of merchants within the company, were replaced in 1612 by terminable joint stocks, which covered operations over a term of years. Not until 1657 was a permanent joint stock established. The company's objective was the spices of the East Indies, and it went to India only for the secondary purpose of securing cottons for sale to the spice growers. The British East Indian venture met with determined Dutch opposition, culminating in the massacre at Amboina in 1623. In India, the English found the Portuguese enjoying Mughal recognition at the western Indian port of Surat. Portuguese command of the sea nullified the English embassy to to the Mughal court in spite of its countenance by the Emperor Jahangir. However, the English victory at Solihull in 1612 over the Portuguese, whose control of the pilgrim sea route to Mecca was resented by the Mughals, brought a dramatic change. The embassy of Sir Thomas Roe, 1615–18, to the Mughal court secured an accord in the form of a farman, or grant of privileges, by which the English secured the right to trade and to establish factories in return for becoming the virtual naval auxiliaries of the empire. This success, with England's exclusion from Indonesia by the Dutch in the same period, determined that India, not the Far East, should be the chief theatre of English activity in Asia. There followed through the 17th century a period of peaceful trading through factories operating under Mughal grants. This held good for Surat and later for Hooghly, 1651, in Bengal. In the south, the factory at Masulipatam, 1611, was moved to the site of Madras, now Chennai, granted by a Hindu Raja, 1640. It shortly, 1647, came under the control of the Sultans of Golconda and thence passed to the Mughals in 1687. The only exception to this arrangement was the island port of Bombay, now Mumbai. Although independently held, its trade was small because the Marathas, soon locked in combat with the Mughals, held the hinterland. The trade the company developed differed radically from that of the Dutch. It was a trade in bulk instead of in highly priced luxury goods. The profits were a factor of volume rather than scarcity. It worked in competitive instead of monopolistic conditions. It depended upon political goodwill instead of intimidation. The English trade became more profitable than that of the Dutch, because the smaller area covered and the lack of armed forces necessary to enforce monopoly reduced overhead charges. But it encountered its own difficulties. The Indians would take little other than silver in exchange for their goods, and the export of bullion was anathema to the concept of mercantilism, then England's reigning political economy. Lack of military power meant management of Asian governments instead of their coercion. Lack of home dominance meant compromise and hazard of fortune. To solve the silver problem, the English developed a system of country trade not unlike that of the Dutch, the profits of which helped to pay for the annual investment of goods for England. Madras and Gujarat supplied cotton goods, and Gujarat supplied indigo as well. Silk, sugar, and saltpeter, for gunpowder, came from Bengal, while there was a spice trade along the Malabar coast from 1615 on a competitive basis with the Dutch and Portuguese. Opium was shipped to East Asia, where it later became the basis of the Anglo-Chinese tea trade. The merchants lived in factories, trading houses, or in a collegiate type of settlement where life was confined, colorful, and often short. The company had many difficulties in England. There was mercantilist disapproval and mercantile jealousy of the company's monopoly. Moreover, government instability threatened the company's privilege. King Charles I encouraged the rival Courtine Association, 1635, and Oliver Cromwell allowed virtual free trade until 1657. Under the later Stuarts the company prospered, only to have its hopes dashed by a war in India and by the Whigs' glorious revolution of 1688–89. The Whigs promoted a new company in 1698, which, however, failed to oust the old one after some years of struggle. In 1702 the government insisted on a merger, which was completed in 1708–09 under the name of the United Company of Merchants of England trading to the East Indies. This was the body that 40 years later launched on the sea of Indian politics. A way for rivals to harass the company, besides a tax on the export of bullion, was to limit the sale of cotton goods in England. In 1700 the sale of Asian silks and printed or dyed cottons was forbidden, but trade continued for export to continental Europe. After 1700, the company found a new profitable line in the Chinese tea trade, whose imports increased more than 40-fold by 1750. In India, the company suffered a serious setback when it resolved, under the inspiration of Sir Josiah Child, to resort to armed trade and to attack the Mughals. The Emperor Aurangzeb was too strong, however, and the venture, 1686-90, ended in disaster. Out of this fiasco came both the foundation of Calcutta, now Kolkata, by Job Charnock in 1690, a mudflat that had the advantage of a deep anchorage, and the age of fortified factories surrounded by satellite towns. These were the answers, with Mughal consent, to increasing Indian insecurity. The Madras factory was already fortified, and Fort William in Calcutta followed in 1696. The company thus had, with independent Bombay, 3 centers of Indian power. For the next half-century, the company confined its relations with the Mughals, who had now spread to the deep south beyond Madras, to disputes over rights and terms of trade at local levels. Fresh privileges were obtained in Delhi, and these they were content to argue about rather than fight for. The factors were learning the art of Indian diplomacy, as they had formerly to learn the arts of Indian commercial management. The city of Kolkata, formerly Calcutta, the capital of West Bengal state, is in northeastern India. Formerly the capital, 1772 to 1911, of British India, it has long been one of India's largest metropolitan areas. It is located on the Hooghly River, about 96 miles, 154 kilometers, north of the river's mouth in the Bay of Bengal. The English East India Company established a trading centre at the site in 1690, which grew and became the seat of the British province called the Bengal Presidency. It was captured by the Nawab. Local ruler of Bengal, who in 1756 imprisoned a number of British there, in a prison known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. The city was retaken by the British under Robert Clive. Calcutta was an extremely busy 19th century commercial centre, but it began to decline with the removal of the colonial capital to Delhi in 1911. The decline continued when Bengal was partitioned between India and Pakistan in 1947 and when Bangladesh was created in 1971. The flood of refugees from those political upheavals boosted the city's population, but also significantly added to its widespread poverty. Despite its problems, Kolkata remains the dominant urban area of eastern India and a major educational and cultural centre. The French. The French had shown an interest in the East from the early years of the 16th century, but individual efforts had been checked by the Portuguese. The first viable French company, the French East India Company, was launched by the Minister of Finance Jean-Baptiste Colbert, with the support of Louis XIV, in 1664. After some false starts, the French company acquired Pondicherry, now Puducherry, 85 miles, 137 kilometers, south of Madras, from a local ruler in 1674. It obtained Chandarnagore, now Chandarnagar, 16 miles, 26 kilometers, north of Calcutta, from the Mughal governor in 1690-92. At first, the French initiatives suffered from the mixing of grandiose political and colonial schemes with those of trade, but, under the care of Francois Martin from 1674, the company turned increasingly to trade and began to prosper. The progress of the settlements was interrupted by events in Europe. The Dutch captured Pondicherry in 1693. When the French regained it under the Peace of Ryswick, 1697, they gained the best fortifications in India, but lost their trade. By 1706 the French enterprise seemed moribund. The company's privileges were let to a group of St. Malo merchants from 1708 to 20. After 1720, however, came a dramatic change. The company was reconstituted, and over the next 20 years its trade was expanded, and new stations were opened. The Indian Ocean island of Mauritius was finally settled in 1721. Mahe in Malabar and Karaikal on the eastern coast were acquired in 1725 and 1739, respectively. Chandarnagar was revived. The French company remained under the close supervision of the government, which nominated the directors and, from 1733, guaranteed fixed dividends. In spite of the company's growth and its fostering by government, its sales in Europe in 1740 were only about half those of England's East India Company. Its trade was large enough to be worth seizing, but not great enough to rival that of the English. Other enterprises in India included a Danish East India Company, which operated intermittently from 1616 from Tranquebar in southern India, acquiring Serampore, now Sri Rampur, in Bengal in 1755, and the Ostend Company of Austrian Netherlands merchants. From 1723, a serious rival until eliminated by diplomatic means in 1731. Efforts by Swedes and Prussians proved abortive. The Anglo-French struggle, 1740 to 63. In 1740 India appeared to be relatively tranquil. In the north the Persian Nadir Shah's invasion, 1739, had proved to be only a large-scale raid. In the Deccan the Nizam al-Mulk provided some measure of stability. In western India, the Marathas were dominant. However, there was competition between Marathas, Mughals, and local rulers for political supremacy in the Deccan. There was a sense of impending change in the air. The Mughal emperor was sickly, the Nizam was aged, and the Marathas were active and ambitious. It was on this scene that events in Europe precipitated an Anglo-French struggle in India. The War of the Austrian Succession began with Frederick II of Prussia, Caesar of Silesia in 1740. France supported Prussia, and from 1740 to England supported Austria. The stage thus set, the English decided that the French-Indian trade was too powerful to be left alone. The neutrality of previous years was therefore abandoned. Both sides depended on sea power for success, but it was the French who moved first. With an improvised fleet from Mauritius, Bertrand Francois Mahe, Comte de la Bourdonnais, drove the British in alarm to Bengal and captured Madras after a week's siege in September 1746. Quarrels between La Bourdonnais and the governor of Pondicherry, Joseph Francois Dupleix, marred this unexpected success, but an English attack on Pondicherry was repelled. Then the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748, which ended the war, returned Madras to the British in exchange for Cape Breton Island in North America. It would thus appear that the status quo had been restored. In fact, the situation had radically changed. Madras was now recognized as British by European treaty, and this was accepted by one of the rival Indian chiefs. The French had grown in prestige as skillful soldiers and in power by detachments of the French fleet left behind on La Bourdonnais' departure. Above all, the astute Dupleix had seen the opportunity offered for exploiting the new French reputation in the confused politics of the region. For some years there had been a disputed succession to the governorship of Karnataka, the Carnatic, itself a dependency of the Nizam al-Mulk of Hyderabad. The Nizam had installed a new Carnatic Nawab, deputy, from the Arabic Nawab, in 1743, but the dispute smoldered on between the partisans of the two rival families, who looked impartially to Marathas, Mughals, and Europeans for help. In 1748, on the morrow of Aix-la-Chapelle, an occasion for French interference occurred with the death of the aged Nizam al-Mulk. There was a disputed succession between his second son and a grandson, Muzaffar Jan. Dupleix, encouraged by his easy ripples of the Carnatic Nawab from the walls of Madras, decided to support both Muzaffar and the claimant to the Carnatic Nawabship, Chanda Sahib. Dupleix's reward for success would be the means of ruining the British trade in southern India and gaining an indefinite influence over the affairs of the whole Deccan. At first fortune favoured him. The Carnatic Nawab was killed in the Battle of Ambur, 1749, which demonstrated convincingly the superiority of European arms and methods of warfare. The threatening invasion of the new Nizam, now a hereditary title, Nair Jang, ended with the Nizam's murder in December 1750. French troops conducted Muzaffar Jang toward Hyderabad. When Muzaffar in turn was murdered 3 months later, the French succeeded in placing the late Nizam's third son, Alabad Jang, on the Hyderabad throne. Thenceforward, in the person of the skillful Charles, Marquis de Bussy-Castelnau, Dupleix had a kingmaker at the center of Muslim power in the Deccan. The British response to these dramatic successes was to support for the Carnatic Nawabship the late Nawab's son, Muhammad Ali, who had taken refuge in the rock fortress of Trichinopoly, now Tiruchirappalli. They had already interfered in the affairs of Tanjavur, and were no strangers to Indian politics. The French supported Chanda Sahib for the Nawabship. There thus developed what was really a private war between the two companies. Bussy-Castelnau was established at Hyderabad with the revenues of the northern Sarkars, 6 coastal districts, to support his army. In the south the French had only Muhammad Ali to remove. But from 1751 Dupleix's star began to wane. Robert Clive, later first Baron Clive of Plassey, a discontented young British factor who had left the counting house for the field, seized the fort of Arcot, political capital of the Carnatic, with 210 men in August 1751. This daring stroke had the hoped-for effect of diverting half of Chanda Sahib's army to its recovery. Clive's successful 50-day defense permitted Muhammad Ali to procure allies from Tanjore and the Marathas. The French were worsted, and they were eventually forced to surrender in June 1752. Dupleix never recovered from this blow. He was superseded in August 1754 by the director Charles Robert Godhu, who made a not unfavorable settlement with the British. The French gained but a brief respite. The 7 Years' War in Europe, in which Britain and France were once more on opposite sides, broke out in 1756. Both sides sent armaments to the east. The first British force was diverted to Bengal, so that the French General Thomas Arthur Lally had an advantage on his arrival in 1758. Lally was brave but headstrong and tactless after taking Fort Street. He lost time and credit marching to Tanjore, where he forfeited Indian sympathy by executing temple Brahmins. Then his attack on Madras, 1758-59, miscarried, while Clive's troops from Bengal defeated the French garrison of the northern Sarkars. When Sir Eyre Coote arrived with reinforcements, the British defeated Lally decisively at the Battle of Vandivash in January 1760. Bussy-Castelnau, who had been recalled from Hyderabad, was captured, and Lally retreated to Pondicherry, where, after an 8-month siege made tense by bitter recrimination, he surrendered in January 1761. The French threat to British power in India had come to a temporary close. This defeat could be partly blamed on Lally, but there were also other, more vital causes. An overriding factor was the British command of the sea. Lally could get no allies for lack of money, and no money for lack of supply from France. The British could supply Madras from both Britain and Bengal. The French company was under the control of the French government, and the company suffered from the vicissitudes of its politics. European military superiority. The supremacy in Indian politics, which seemed to come so suddenly to the Europeans in India, also requires explanation. There was the matter of arms. The Mughals imported their cavalry tactics from Turkestan and their artillery from Turkey. Their firearms remained slow-firing and cumbersome, so that they were outclassed both in rate of fire and in range by the 18th century European musket and the cannon landed from European fleets. In the face of charging Mughal cavalry, infantry armed with such faster and more accurate weapons could fire 3 times instead of once, thus destroying the traditional dominance held by heavy cavalry in Indian warfare. Moreover, beyond this technical advantage, the Europeans also had the advantage of discipline. Troops with loyalty guaranteed by regular pay were more than a match for the personal retinues or mercenary soldiers of the Indian chiefs, however brave the latter might be individually. A chronic problem with Indian armies at that time was the lack of means to pay them. Campaigns would be diverted for collecting revenue for this purpose. When Europeans later trained Indians in the European manner, their advantage increased. Discipline removed the uncertain factor of personal leadership, and regular pay removed the Indian general's bugbear of mutiny. A further advantage was civil discipline. The European forces were directed by men themselves, under discipline, who were without hereditary connections or ties to the local population, though to modern eyes European company men often seemed refractory or disloyal. By standards of India, at that time they were regularity itself. Indian loyalty was to an individual leader who might be killed, to relatives who might back the wrong side in a conflict, and to governments that might, and often did, for various reasons, fail to pay their troops. On the Indian side, whatever the situation, someone was nearly always looking over his shoulder thinking of the chances of a change of leadership or a successful coup, and what this might mean to him personally. Thus, the European possessed not only an expertise denied to the Indians, but also a spirit of confidence, a tenacity, and a will to win that was rare in the Indian forces of the time. Revolution in Bengal. The revolution in Bengal was the product of a number of unrelated causes. The imminence of the 7 Years' War prompted the British to send out Clive with a force to Madras in 1755. Succession troubles in Bengal combined with British mercantile incompetence to produce a crisis at a moment when the French in South India were still awaiting reinforcements from France. Ali Vardi Khan, the Nawab and virtual ruler of Bengal, died in April 1756, leaving his power to his young grandson Siraj al-Dawla. The latter's position was insecure because of discontent among his officers, both Hindu and Muslim, and because he himself was at the same time both headstrong and vacillating. On an exaggerated report that the British were fortifying Calcutta, he attacked and took the city after a 4-day siege on 20th June 1756. The flight of the British governor and several councillors added ignominy to defeat. The survivors were held for a night in the local lockup, known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Many were dead the next morning. News of this disaster caused consternation in Madras. A force preparing to oust Bussy Castelnau from the Deccan was diverted to Bengal, giving Clive an army of 900 Europeans and 1,500 Indians. He relieved the Calcutta survivors and recovered the city on 2 January 1757. An indecisive engagement led to a treaty with Siraj al-Dawla on February 9, which restored the company's privileges, gave permission to fortify Calcutta, and declared an alliance. This was a decisive point in British Indian history. According to plan, Clive should have returned to Madras to pursue the campaign against the French, But he did not. He sensed both the hostility and insecurity of Siraj al-Dawla's position and began to receive overtures to support a military coup. The chance of installing a friendly and dependent Nawab seemed too good to be missed. Having taken this decision, Clive chose the right candidate in Mir Jafar, an elderly general with much influence in the army. In so acting, Clive was probably influenced by the example of Bassi Castelnau at Hyderabad. For 6 years, Bassi Castelnau had maintained himself with an Indo-French force, sustaining the Nizam, Allahabad Jang, and maintaining French influence in the largest South Indian state with outstanding success. This system of a sponsored Indian state, controlled but not administered, was the one Clive had in mind for Bengal. The prospects for success seemed good. The event, however, proved otherwise, and there were reasons for this not realized at the time. The chiefs were so lacking in vigor that they made little resistance to British encroachments. External danger could come from only one direction and source, the Mughal authority, and that was at the moment in dissolution. While Bassi Castelnau had no French merchants to satisfy, the British merchants in Calcutta were ready and eager to exploit the situation. And, because the British Company's government was made up entirely of merchants, it is easy to understand why the sponsored state of 1757 became the virtually annexed state of 1765. Before breaking with Siraj al-Dawla, Clive took the French settlement of Chandenagore, which the Nawab left to its fate lest he need British help to repulse an Afghan attack from the north. The actual conflict with Siraj al-Dawla, at Plassey, 23 June 1757, was decided by Clive's resolute refusal to be overawed by superior numbers, by dissensions within the Nawab's camp, by Mir Jafar's failure to support his superior, and by Siraj al-Dawla's own loss of nerve. Plassey was, in fact, more of a cannonade than a battle. It was followed by the flight and execution of Siraj al-Dawla, by the occupation of Murshidabad, the capital, and by the installation of Mir Jafar as the new Nawab. Clive now controlled a sponsored state, and he played the part with great skill. His position was prejudiced at the outset by the Nawab's failure to find the expected hoarded treasure with which to fulfill his financial promises to the British. The Nawab therefore looked for financial support toward his Hindu deputies, with whom saving was second nature. Clive had therefore to intervene repeatedly. In 1759 he defended Patna from attack by the heir to the Mughal throne, Ali Gauhar, later Shah Alam II, who hoped to strengthen his position in the confused world of Delhi politics by acquiring Bihar. Clive also had to deal with the Dutch, who, hearing of Mir Jafar's restiveness and alarmed by the growth of British power in Bengal, sent an armament of 6 ships to their station at Chinsura on the Hooghly River. Though Britain was at peace with the Netherlands at the time, Clive maneuvered the Dutch into acts of aggression, captured their fleet, defeated them on land, and exacted compensation. They retained Chinsura but could never again challenge the British position in Bengal. Clive left Calcutta on 25 February 1760, at the height of his fame and aged only 34, looking forward to an English political career. The Nawab was completely dependent on the British, to whose trade it seemed that the rich resources of Bengal were now open. But the prospect was less brilliant than it looked, and for this, and for the troubles that ensued in the next few years, Clive had a direct responsibility. Two measures undermined the plan of a sponsored state, leading to the company's bankruptcy on the one hand and to the virtual annexation of Bengal on the other. The first of these was an understanding with Mir Jafar, not mentioned in the actual treaty, that personal domestic trade, i.e., trade within India, of company employees would be exempted from the usual tolls and customs duties. The company's trade with Europe had since 1717 been exempt from such taxes, but the application of such concessions to individual employees, or to anyone, for that matter, who held an exemption pass, dastak, was a fiscal disaster, since the pass system was widely abused. Local Indian traders were soon unable to compete against rivals with such an advantage, and the company itself was soon outpositioned by its own employees, who received little compensation from the company and relied on their own entrepreneurial skills to make ends meet. From free trade, many company employees passed to intimidation, employing agents who used the British name to terrorize the countryside and infringe on the company's monopoly. The second measure was the acceptance of gifts. This was not forbidden by the company and was, in fact, a recognized custom, but it opened the floodgates of corruption. On the strength of rumors regarding the vast sum of the Murshidabad treasury, large amounts were paid to the armed forces and to the company leaders following the city's capitulation. In addition, Clive obtained a further Mughal title and then claimed a revenue assignment, or Jagir, for its upkeep, which was worth a large annual sum. In the context of contemporary values, these grants equaled nearly one-fourth of the average annual Bengal revenue and represented some 6% of the then annual revenue of Great Britain. With such a vigorous opening of the floodgates, it is not surprising that the other servants of the company asked for more almost as a matter of right, and that the company's directors in London, with relatives and connections on the spot, preferred verbal denunciations to any resolute or sustained action. The effects became speedily apparent when in fact the Murshidabad treasure turned out to be only a fraction of its rumored value, so that, as Clive later admitted to a parliamentary enquiry, the Nawab had to sell jewels, goods, and furniture to meet his obligations. The results of these measures unfolded in the next decade and continued to be felt for a generation. The period of disorder, 1760 to 72. The departure of Clive signaled the release of acquisitive urges by the company's Bengal servants. These urges were so strong that the governor, Henry Vansittart, served 1760 to 64, found himself unable to control them. Under the company's constitution, he had only one vote in a council of up to a dozen and could be overruled by any knot of determined men. During these years, a body of British merchants, long separated from British standards and social restraints, suddenly found themselves with real but undefined authority over the whole of a large and rich province. It is not surprising that they thought mainly of getting rich quickly. The first step was the deposition of the Nawab Mir Jafar on the grounds of old age and incompetence. He was supplanted by his son-in-law, Mir Qasim, after the latter had paid a large gratuity to the company and to Vansittart personally. In addition, he ceded to the British the districts of Budwan, Midnapur, and Chittagong. Both sides wanted power, and both sides were short of money. The Nawab had lost substantial land revenue and the lucrative tolls on the British merchants' private trade. The company was receiving no remittances from Britain, because the directors considered that Bengal should pay for itself. A clash was inevitable. Mir Qasim removed his capital to distant Munger, where he could not be so easily overseen, asserted his authority in the districts, and raised a disciplined force under an Armenian officer. He then turned to the company and negotiated a settlement with Vansittart, by which the company's merchants were to pay an ad valorem duty of 9% against an Indian merchant's duty of 40%. At this the Calcutta Council revolted, reducing the company's duty to 2.5% and on salt only. The breach came in 1763, when Mir Qasim, after defeat in 4 pitched battles, murdered his Indian bankers and British prisoners and fled to Awadh. The next year Mir Qasim returned with the Emperor Shah Alam II and his minister Shuja al-Dawla to be finally defeated at the Battle of Buxar. That conflict, rather than Plassey, was the decisive battle that gave Bengal to the British. These events had been viewed with growing alarm in London. The news of the Mir Qasim campaign coincided with the victory of Clive's faction in the company over that of Lawrence Sullivan. Clive used it to appoint himself governor, with power to act over the head of the council. He intended an administrative reformation and a political settlement. He arrived in May 1765 to find that the British victory at Buxar had placed Shah Alam in his hands, but had created a situation of deep confusion in other respects. Mir Jafar had been restored to power, but soon died. His second son succeeded him after bestowing lavish gratuities to the company. The British merchants and their agents were the unresisted predators of the Bengal economy, and no one knew the next step to take. Clive acted with extraordinary vigor. Within 4 days of arrival, he had set up a select committee, and, when he left less than 2 years later, he had effected another revolution. Turning to India's political situation, Clive had to decide where to stop. No one barred his way to Delhi, and he could at that moment have turned the whole Mughal Empire into a company-sponsored state. But he realized that Delhi was easier to have than to hold. He fixed his frontier at the borders of Bihar and Awadh. Shah Alam was given the districts of Kora and Allahabad, and he settled in the latter city, with a tribute, or subsidy, from Bengal that was nearly 10% of its estimated revenue. Shuja al-Dawla received back Awadh, with a guarantee of its security, in return for paying the troops involved and a cash indemnity. These two were to be buffers between the company and the Marathas and possible marauders from the north. Clive's next step was to settle Bengal's own status. The Mughal emperor still had much influence, though little power. His complete disfavor might therefore have done the company more harm than good. Clive's solution was to obtain from Shah Alam the Devani, or revenue-collecting power, in Bengal and Bihar. The company was thus the imperial Divan, for those two provinces. The Nawab was left in charge of the judiciary and magistracy, but he was helpless because he had no army and could get money to raise one only from the company. This was Clive's system of dual government. The actual administration remained in Indian hands, and for superintendents Clive appointed a deputy Diwan, Muhammad Ria Khan, who was at the same time appointed the Nawab's deputy. The chain was thus complete. The company, acting in the name of the emperor and using Indian personnel and the traditional apparatus of government, now ruled Bengal. The company's agent was Ria Khan. The success of the experiment turned on his efficiency and the extent of the governor's support. Within the company, Clive enforced his authority by accepting some resignations and enforcing others. Gifts amounting to a value of more than 4,000 rupees were forbidden, and those between that figure and 1,000 rupees were only to be received with official consent. The regulation of private trade was more difficult, for the company paid virtually no salaries. Clive formed a society of trade, which operated the salt monopoly, to provide salaries on a graduated scale, but the company directors disallowed this on the ground of expense, and 2 years later they replaced it by commissions on the revenue, which cost the company more. Finally, Clive dealt with overgrown military allowances with equal vigor, overcoming a mutiny headed by a brigade commander. He used a legacy from Mir Jafar to start the first pension fund for the Indian Army. Clive left Calcutta in February 1767. His work, diplomatic, political, and administrative, was a beginning rather than a complete settlement. But in each direction, instead of looking back to the past, it reached out to the future. This creative period exacted a heavy price. Clive was pursued to England by his enemies, who launched a parliamentary attack, which, though triumphantly repulsed in 1773, led to his suicide the following year. It is worth noting how the company's servants so enriched themselves at that time that they undermined the economy of Bengal, and those who returned to Britain became a byword for ostentation. Apart from the great political prizes already mentioned, it must be remembered that all the company's servants were engaged in private trade on their own account. Their new authority and the company's power enabled them to exploit their trade with little hindrance. They had the means of using intimidation, through their agents, against Indian rivals such as the indigo growers and Indian police, customs, revenue, and judicial officials. Presents and bribes were the price Indians had to pay for freedom from harassment. They were able, through their connection with the administration, to arrange virtual monopolies for particular articles in particular districts, fixing a low purchase price as well as a high selling price. They could arrange commissions on revenue collection, mercantile transactions, and any form of commercial activity. What was not done through agents could be arranged through intermediaries, who also, of course, had their own compensation. Thus, a man could make a fortune, lose it in Britain, return for another, lose it again, and return for a third. It is significant that from the time of Clive's second governorship lamentations increased that the opportunities for quick fortunes were slipping away.